Hello there. Welcome to the Saroy channel wherever you are in the world, and so much love to each and every one of you. I do hope you're doing incredibly well. I'm doing great, thank you very much, and I'm so excited that you've joined me for part 2 of our story tonight. So make sure you go and get that lovely hot cup of cocoa or coffee or whatever it is you drink, because we're going to get straight into our story now. It's all about Aunt Betsy's funeral and the bizarre way in which she died, and perhaps we're going to find out more about that. But before we do, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell and the thumbs up, and let's continue with part 2 of our story tonight.
Don't you remember, Rose dear? Something was definitely troubling your great-aunt Betsy before she died. I tried to confront her about it, but she denied that there was anything wrong. But I know something was really irking her. Think about it, she was always going into the woods to collect woodland herbs, wild mushrooms and ginger, wasn't she? You don't suppose, Rose, that she encountered that mountain lion? Maybe it was wandering around her property with its cubs. It possibly felt threatened by your great-aunt Betsy. It could have launched an attack on her. Aunt Betsy did not live far away from the Hodge farmhouse, so that was obviously the area where the mountain lion was hanging around. Look, Mum, I don't have any idea whether Aunt Betsy was troubled before she died or not. But we will never know the answers to that question, will we? There is no point in going on and on over the events of her inauspicious death, of which we are so clueless about, as it's just so desperately upsetting. It only makes things far worse for us. We can't harp over things we simply can't change. There's no point in it. I'm telling you, Rose, I've known your Aunt Betsy all my life, and I know what she's like. She's such an open book normally. But that was why I was so concerned about her well-being, because she was very disquieted about something. I know she was. I could tell she was in a bad way. She'd lost a whole lot of weight. Her clothes were hanging on her. That's never happened before. There were black bags under her eyes, very conspicuous they were, and that for me is a telltale sign that she wasn't sleeping properly. I sensed that something was really bothering her. And then this has to happen. I just don't understand any of it. It is strange, Mum. Betsy was an open book, you're right about that. But we'll never know what was going on with her. Oh dear, I just can't bear any of this. It had been a battle for my mother to make the laboriously challenging superhuman effort to come to the church, to bid her final farewells to Aunt Betsy, but she managed to do it anyway. I guess for my mother, losing her mother's sister was rather like losing her only connection to her late mother, so it hit her really hard. No one in our small rural Colorado town could comprehend what had actually happened to great-aunt Betsy. Everybody in town was naturally on tenterhooks, as by all accounts, we all assumed that there was some kind of predator out there who had killed great-aunt Betsy. The big question on everyone's lips was what had killed her, and did this thing, whatever it was, potentially impose a threat to the rest of us? Most people were of the salient opinion that whatever had happened to Aunt Betsy was simply a fluke of nature, a case of being in the wrong place at the wrong time, when bad luck strikes you down like a formidable foe that you never saw coming. They were probably right about that. Still, despite this, I'm sure people were secretly disturbed by the macabre manner in which my aunt had mysteriously met her end. And of course it invoked in people more questions than answers. People don't like it when answers to questions cannot be found. It leaves them with a sense of great disquiet. It was the town sheriff who unfortunately found my great-aunt Betsy's mangled body, and it was a gruesome sight that I dare say will be graphically burned into his memory forever, as something he will never be able to forget, during his time on the force, so to speak, as, let's just say, some indelible scars refuse to fade away, even with the long passage of time. It all began when Aunt Betsy's best friend, Hannah Odassis, had contacted the sheriff and reported her best friend missing, that the wheels were put into motion to find the whereabouts of my missing great-aunt. I'm telling you, Sheriff, it is not like Betsy not to respond to me. I phoned her so many times, and she never answered. She was not in the house, which was extraordinarily strange. I knocked on the front door for ages. So I let myself in. I discovered her slow cooker had been left on for a very long time. The food in there was cremated. Burnt to a cinder it was. It must have been cooking away for a couple of days at the very least. The house smelt of burning charcoal. I used the spare key under the doormat to get into the house, because I knew, Sheriff, that something was desperately wrong. I thought that maybe poor Betsy had had a nasty fall of some kind. Let's just say she wasn't exactly nimble on her feet. It occurred to me that she might not be able to call for help. I was dreading what I would find when I entered her house, but it was empty. But as I say, I could smell the burning very strongly from the kitchen, so I knew something was decidedly off. No one ever leaves a slow cooker on so long that the contents begin to burn. I only found Aunt Betsy's hungry cat Greta. She obviously hadn't eaten in quite a while, so I fed her. She wouldn't stop meowing, pretty much demanding me to feed her. Poor thing, she was desperately hungry, so I opened a can for her. She practically gobbled it all down. Betsy would never ever forget to feed Greta. I knew something terribly bad had happened to her, Sheriff. We were supposed to go on a road trip together for a couple of days. Well, for a few days, actually. We had it all meticulously planned out. Where we would go, where we would stay, what we would visit, and what we would see. She was looking very forward to it. My son Lincoln was going to look after Greta the cat and house-sit for Betsy while we were away. We speak to each other twice a day, every single day. We're very close, Sheriff. When Betsy didn't call me and wasn't answering her cell, I knew at once something was up. I had this gnawing feeling in my gut, Sheriff, that something wasn't right. Now there is no sign of her anywhere. Her vehicle is parked in the carport. She hasn't left the house. Her purse and her cell phone are on the kitchen table. Her keys are also in the house. It doesn't look like she left the house. So where is she, Sheriff? Hannah had wailed.
Not to worry, Hannah, the sheriff had assured her. We will go and look for her. The first port of call will be those woods. Do you know if she would take walks in the woods?
Oh, all the time, Sheriff, Hannah admitted. She loves walking among the trees there. It's good exercise for her. Oh, goodness gracious, Sheriff, said Hannah with wide eyes. What if she had a nasty fall in the woods? Couldn't get back into the house to call for help? What if she's been out there in the open for a couple of days now?
Look, Mrs. Odassis, please calm down, said the sheriff kindly. There's no point in panicking at this stage until we find out exactly what has happened to your friend. I'm sure we will have answers soon enough.
Unfortunately, answers came far too soon. The sheriff discovered Aunt Betsy lying in the woodgrove among a plethora of fallen leaves. She was under a dead tree. She was deceased. Big chunks of her flesh had been gouged out of the torso, her innards removed, her head twisted at an odd angle. Worse still, her eyes were missing from their sockets. All the sheriff could say when he saw Great-Aunt Betsy is, "What the hell happened here?" Great-Aunt Betsy's remains were found in quite the state. Such a dreadful state. The sheriff had never seen anything like it before. The sheriff admitted that there was a disgustingly putrid smell in the grove, the smell of death and decay. He didn't believe the smell came from Aunt Betsy's decaying corpse, because that would have been too soon. It had left the residents of our small town very baffled. Most believed that Aunt Betsy had been the victim of a bear attack. Well, that is what I think they wanted to believe. But I was not so sure. Bears don't go throwing intestines onto tree branches, do they? Or maybe I stand corrected on that. Then again, I've never heard of a bear gouging out the eyes of a human being. Something insidiously evil had happened to Great-Aunt Betsy, but there was no point in harping on about it, because answers would never be forthcoming, and I had had to accept that. The small church was packed, with everyone appropriately wearing black, to mark this inauspicious, very sad occasion, along with solemn expressions that everybody was wearing on their faces. Many people were shedding tears, dabbing their eyes with tissues and blowing their noses fiercely. I tried not to look at the locals in attendance, as seeing all the mourners would make me all the more grievously upset. The mood in the church was very sombre. My eyes were firmly fixed on the wooden casket in the front of the church that was covered in a dazzling bouquet of pretty fresh flowers that I had specifically chosen for my great-aunt Betsy. Pastor George Ferris stood in the front of the church, looking very chagrined. I watched him walking up to the podium rather stiffly, where he made his sorrowful speech. I knew he'd been particularly fond of my great-aunt Betsy. I could see the tears in his eyes, that he appeared to be fighting back with quite some difficulty. He had been mortified to learn of great-aunt Betsy's tragic passing, and the bizarre way in which she had met her end.
Thank you for coming here today. As you know, we are all gathered here in very unforeseen, tragic circumstances, when one of our beloved flock has been stolen from us. As to what happened to Betsy, we may never know the answer to that question. I think we sadly need to accept that. Unfortunately, in life tragedies happen, for no rhyme or reason. But we need to remember the good Lord is always in control. We can be reassured that Betsy is in a better place now. She is probably looking right down on us, even as I speak, for I am quite sure the dead are aware of what goes on at their own funerals.
There was a murmur of amens from the congregation, as people nodded their heads in agreement to the pastor's lamentable words.
This is not a sad day, by any manner of means, said the pastor. Far from it, in fact. The good book tells us that the day of our death is better than the very day of our birth. This is a day of rejoicing, for Betsy is now in the arms of our loving Father. We must remember that Jesus took the sting out of death by dying on the cross of Calvary. We must never lose sight of that. To die is gain, and when we leave this earth on the day we die, what awaits us on the other side is so much better than what we have here on this earth. We live in a precarious, unpredictable world, where there are wars, rumours of wars, conflicts, murders, rapes. But we also live in a world of great love, of understanding and forgiveness. And despite everything, one day good will triumph over evil, and the man of sin will be brought to account, and we must never forget that either. Where Betsy is now, there will be no more tears, no crying or lamenting. The lion will lie down with the lamb, and the little children will happily play among the wild animals, and they too will not be harmed.
Once again there were amens in the congregation of people, as everybody nodded their heads in agreement.
I knew Betsy for a very long time, said the pastor. She was actively involved in the church and helped me out with charitable affairs. We all know that she was like an open book. What you see is what you get with Betsy. She was never afraid to speak her mind, which could be a tad uncomfortable at times for some people, but in my opinion that made her remarkably refreshing. So often in our society we hide behind the truth and say what is acceptable, but Betsy told it as it was. That woman I don't think ever lied a day in her life, not even to be polite. My wife Hilda remembers Betsy coming up to her in the supermarket one day and saying to her very matter-of-factly, "My dear, look at you. You look absolutely awful in that dress. It does you no favours. The colour makes your skin a sickly green." The dress my wife was wearing was a hideous mud-colour green. I hated the thing. It was atrocious. But I will be honest with you. I didn't have the guts to tell my wife how unflattering that dress looked on her. But Betsy told it as it was.
Hilda Ferris, the pastor's wife, was sitting in the pew opposite. She was nodding her head furiously, smiling and crying at the same time, while blowing her nose loudly into a tissue.
When Hilda came home to me that evening, after she'd been to the supermarket, wearing that hideous mud-coloured dress, she was not in exactly a very good mood. She told me what Betsy had said to her about the dress.
I bumped into Betsy in town. She had the audacity and cheek to tell me in no uncertain terms that I look awful in this dress. She told me it makes my skin look green. How rude can you get?
I looked at my wife and said, Hilda, maybe you should listen to Betsy's advice. My wife looked at me in turn and said,
Is my dress really that awful?
I said to her, I'm afraid it is. Hilda nodded her head again. You see, my wife knew I was never going to tell her the truth about that hideously ugly dress, because I know women can get very affronted and sensitive if you criticize them all the time. Many men in this congregation will agree with me on this. Yet Hilda had no problem in telling me I needed a shave or a haircut, but unfortunately it doesn't work the other way round. But Betsy, she was a remarkable woman. She was right about the dress that my wife had bought. It did her no favours. I tell my wife every day that she's a beautiful woman, as I hope many men in the congregation do with their own wives. But I hated that dress with a passion. But Betsy didn't pack any punches. She told it as it was. And I, for one, was very glad to see the back of that dress.
Everyone in the congregation began to laugh. It was likely they too could tell their own stories about Great-Aunt Betsy's blatant honesty that at times might have caused offence. Personally, I always believed Great-Aunt Betsy genuinely wanted the very best for people. I could tell the people in the congregation appreciated this about my aunt, when they realised her honesty was not to be feared, but to be valued. As I was listening to the pastor going on and on about how wonderful Great-Aunt Betsy had been in life, my stomach began to squirm. I had this urgent need to go to the ladies' room at once. I hurriedly slipped past my husband in the pew. He rolled his eyes in exasperation at me, as if to say, What now? Why are you leaving the pew in the middle of the service? But I ignored him. I quickly hurried into one of the stalls in the ladies' room, clutching my stomach tightly as the spasms persisted. I was wondering if I was going to have a full-blown attack of diarrhea. It certainly felt like it. I knew I couldn't leave the toilet, lest I should have a nasty accident and succeed in soiling myself, which would not be fitting on a day like this. What on earth was wrong with me? My stomach cramps were making me double over in agonizing pain. So I hurriedly opened my purse and dry swallowed a couple of ibuprofen tablets that I always have on hand. I sat on the toilet, waiting for them to take effect, waiting for the dreadful spasms to go away. It was as I was in the stall I heard two women entering the ladies' room. I recognised their voices at once. It was Dawn Keegan and Stella Montgomery. I don't think they realised anyone else was in the ladies' room, as my toilet cubicle was at the far end of the bathroom. It would seem they were having quite the natter together, and so I could not help but eavesdrop on their conversation. The problem was, they were talking about me.
I hate bloody funerals, said Stella. Bloody hate them. I imagined that she was washing her hands at one of the sinks, probably reapplying her lipstick in the mirror, while Dawn watched her. The two were the very best of friends, and hung around together all the time. They'd both been in my class at school growing up, and had been the two women that were very envious when I tied the knot with my husband Barlow, especially Stella, who had rarely fancied Barlow for many years, but he had never given her a second glance. Well, I have to admit the pastor was right about Betsy, came Stella's voice. She might not have been everybody's cup of tea, but she was so honest, told you it as it was. She didn't have a filter, did she? But that's not a bad thing, you know. I remember she told me once the lipstick colour I was wearing was dreadful. I was appreciative of her honesty. I really was. Suffice to say, I never wore that colour again, because I always thought that Betsy had great taste.
Was that the brown shade of lipstick that you used to wear? Asked Dawn.
It was. How do you know?
Because it was hideous, absolutely hideous. I abhorred that colour on you. It did you no favours.
You're my best friend, Dawn, and you never told me this. That's insane.
I didn't tell you because you liked the lipstick so much. It had set you back a lot of money. I didn't have the heart to tell you."
"That's ridiculous, Dawn. You know it is. You're my very best friend. If you think a lipstick colour doesn't look good on me, for goodness sake tell me. That's what friends do. They're honest with each other."
"I'll tell you next time, I promise, Stella."
"Good. I'm glad to hear it." I know that Betsy was brutally honest about everything, absolutely everything. We all know that. But did she tell Rose, her own niece, that that husband of hers has been cheating on her since the very day they got married? I think he had it off with one of the bridesmaids, on their wedding day of all things. Rose is so incredibly naive, isn't she? How can she not know that Barlow is doing the dirty on her behind her back? How can she be so blind as not to see what's going on under her very nose? I almost feel sorry for the woman. Imagine being that pathetically oblivious to the things going on around you.
"Maybe you just don't want to see what is staring you straight in the face," said Dawn reflectively. "I think some women are wired like that. They try and pretend to themselves that their relationships are intact when they're anything but. But I'm sure deep down in their guts, they know exactly what's going on, but they just don't want to admit it to themselves."
"You think Rose knows Barlow is cheating on her?" asked Stella, sounding bewildered. "You really think that?"
"Maybe she has an inkling," said Dawn. "It's a possibility. Think about it. She and Barlow have not had any children together. I know they've been trying, because Barlow told my husband as much. But I think that Rose has secretly been hiding her birth control pills from him. They've been together for years, and they've never had a bun in the oven. So deep down, I'm guessing she knows exactly what's going on with Barlow."
"You really think so?" asked Stella.
"But of course," said Dawn. "I think so. Let's face it. Everybody in town knows about Barlow's scandalous antics, apart from Rose herself, although how it hasn't got back to her boggles the mind. Rose is completely clueless about it all, isn't she? On a conscious level, I mean. Betsy loved Rose with all her heart, didn't she? She always called Rose her favourite great niece. You would have thought with Betsy being so ruthlessly tactless, she would have told Rose that Barlow was cheating on her, if she'd known about it. She'd have never kept something like that a secret. If Betsy had known Barlow had been cheating on her beloved niece, she would have stormed off to their house with a shotgun in her hands. She'd have been so enraged. You know exactly what she was like when she got her knickers into a twist about something. I bet Betsy would have demanded Barlow to leave the marital home at once. She would have told him what a rotten piece of good-for-nothing, that he was, and that he needed to get the hell away from her great niece. You know how incredibly protective she was over Rose. She loved Rose just like a daughter, she did."
"You're right. That's exactly what she would have done, which means despite the gossip in town, it may never have reached Betsy's ears. It couldn't have. And that in itself is a miracle. I don't think Rose's mother knows about the cheating either. Nor does Rose. So those three are the only people left in the dark. I did hear via the grapevine that Betsy once offered to pay Barlow big bucks if he didn't marry Rose. But then you know Betsy. She wasn't exactly loaded, was she? So that didn't get them anywhere. But I bet it would have done if she was minted, because Barlow had no scruples, did he? My bet is he'd have dropped Rose like a hot potato if he could walk away with big bucks to upholster his bank account. Poor Rose. I think she thinks he's working so hard in that new business he recently set up. But most of the time, we know that schmuck is playing the field. I never understood why he ever married Rose in the first place. I mean, she's dreadfully plain, isn't she? And that woman seems to get bigger and bigger every year. She's like a turkey being fattened up for Thanksgiving. At that, the two women laughed, as if they both agreed, while I recoiled, physically squirming in the stall, horrified to be hearing what was being said about me. But it was the startling revelations of Barlow's infidelity that left my heart jiggling loudly in my chest. Could this be true? Barlow had cheated on me since the very day we got married, and worse still, even on our wedding day,
with one of our bridesmaids. It didn't get worse than that. I had been such a fool. I must be a laughing-stock all around town, I thought.
Of course, said Stella. You're absolutely right, Stella. Come to think of it, I'm sure Betsy was never ever told what was going on with her niece. Everyone knows exactly what she'd have done had she known such inflammatory information. If Betsy knew what Rose's husband had been getting up to behind her back all those years, she'd have probably buried him alive under the patio. And frankly, if she had done so, well, I'd have kept her secret for her, and I would have taken it down to my own grave. Let's just say I don't have any time for Barlow. The guy's an absolute loser, and if I were Rose, I'd spit him out with the dirty bathwater. So would I, chuckled Stella. I can't believe I ever thought that man was even remotely attractive. I hate men that sniff around women with such an insatiable appetite, like a dog after a bitch on heat. It makes me sick to the stomach, it really does. Barlow isn't interested in women for their personality. I hate men like that. All he cares about is getting into their pants. It's absolutely disgusting. My bet is that Betsy must have had her suspicions. She was a very shrewd woman, let's not kid. When she was alive, that is. She never missed a beat. I bet she told Rose exactly what she thought of Barlow. But you know Rose. She was so in love with Barlow, wasn't she? I doubt anything her great-aunt told her would ever sink in. That thick head of hers just refuses to believe anything bad that is said about him. If she doesn't realise Barlow has been cheating on her for years, well then I don't feel sorry for her. I'm sorry, but I don't. She deserves everything she gets if she's that dumb. As for Betsy, I do know she never liked Barlow. She told my mother once he was a sewer rat, and she hoped one day that Rose would finally open her eyes and see what he really was like, as she deserved so much better than him. I believe he's having an affair now with that bank teller in town, isn't that right? What's her name again? I've clean forgotten, asked Stella. Oh, you mean Agnes Harris? That's exactly right. I'm not surprised he went for Agnes. Do you see how that woman dresses? She leaves everything hanging out, nothing to the imagination. It beats me why some women dress like that. I guess they want men to look at them all the time. Maybe it elevates their self-esteem. Look at Agnes. Her skirts are so short you can practically see her knickers, and I'm not kidding either. She's blonde and pretty, exactly how Barlow likes them. So she ticks all the right boxes for him, doesn't she? Do you know what really gets me, Dawn? If Barlow likes trashy-looking girls, just like the bank teller in town, what on earth did he ever see in the likes of Rose? That's what I would love to know. Rose might be many things, you know, but that woman's got class and plenty of style, even if she's overweight. In many ways, she is rather like her great-aunt Betsy. Beats me. Maybe he wanted a solid woman to come home to, someone he could rely on, who wouldn't let him down. Think about it, everybody knows that whatever you may think about Rose, she's a fantastic housekeeper, an excellent cook. Some actually might describe her as a domestic goddess. I went to her house for dinner once, and I'm not kidding you. The food she produced was absolutely sensational, to die for. Even my husband was annoyingly going on and on about how excellent her cooking was. I felt decidedly jealous. Green at the gills I was. I so wish I could cook like that. But then again, it's a good thing I can't. I'm telling you, if I ate that kind of food every day, I'd probably be Rose's size by now, or even bigger. It's a good thing the food in my refrigerator is absolutely pitiful. A limp bit of celery, cheese going mouldy, pickles long since past their sell-by date. Even my husband says our 2 dogs eat a hell of a lot better than we do. Think about it for a second. It stands to reason that Barlow would marry her for her cooking abilities. Don't they say a way to a man's heart is through his stomach? I do know for a fact that Barlow rarely enjoys his food. He probably wanted to marry Rose after she cooked him a piece of her apple pie. Men have married women for less, you know. If I was a man, I might have been tempted to marry Rose myself, if she cooked meals like that. Oh my goodness gracious, you're right, Stella. How did I not see this before?
There are men out there that would give their left eye to be married to a woman that can cook. My father used to drool over the likes of Nigella Lawson because she cooked so nicely. I'm not kidding either. I think he fell in love with her a little. And there was the barefoot Contessa as well. My mother was always teasing him about it. I mean, let's not kid. Rose fits the profile of a perfect 1950s housewife. And men these days would dream to have a wife like that, especially in this generation. As for Rose, she's actually quite pretty, really. Too bad she's rather overweight. If she lost some of that weight, my guess is that she'd have many men seriously interested in her. Granted, she's never been a looker, but my bet is, once she lost the weight, she could be a head-turner. Her face is actually quite pretty.
You're right. She's not such a plain Jane. Not like she used to be. It certainly didn't help at school when she had to wear those awful braces. But let's not kid. Rose will always be tubby. She can't help herself. She's got no self-discipline. Do you know she keeps Snickers bars in her purse? I happen to know this because when I was talking to her at the local pet shop in town, she was buying a gift for Betsy's cat Greta. Lo and behold, when she was paying for the cat toy at the counter, I happened to notice her purse was bulging with candies. If I ate that many candies, I'd blow up like a balloon myself. Well, maybe she eats for comfort because she's desperately unhappy. That's what people do when they're very unhappy, you know. Well, I don't blame her for being miserable. I'd be married to that awful toe rag. Hearing the two women talk about one of my dark secrets made my skin burn with embarrassment. I had no idea anyone knew I stored candies in my purse, that I ate in secret if I was feeling rather hungry or emotionally stressed. As I sat in the stall, my stomach clenched, and I listened to Dawn and Stella continue to rattle on about me. But luckily the spasms in my stomach had all but subsided. I was mortified when I realized the whole town must be laughing at me behind my back. I had failed to realize that Barlow had been cheating on me throughout my married life, and I didn't see it at all. Or more to the point, perhaps I didn't want to see it. It was true what the girls had said. Had my great-aunt Betsy known about any of this, she probably would have buried Barlow alive under the patio, or chased him off with a pitchfork. "We better get back to the service, hadn't we? I don't want anyone to notice we've been missing," said Dawn. Thankfully, I heard the door close behind the two women, and once they had left the ladies' bathroom, I sat on the toilet crying my heart out. This time I was weeping, not for Aunt Betsy. I was crying for myself, and how stupid I had been, during the course of my marriage, not to realize that my husband Barlow had been cheating on me. It would explain all his excuses for working late. It was probably all a cover-up, so that Barlow could get up to hanky-panky behind my back. Maybe Dawn and Stella were right about Barlow, that he'd married me because I was an excellent cook, and also because I was incredibly naive, a wife that wouldn't hassle him while he was out there playing the field. Aunt Betsy had been absolutely right about him all along, but I had refused to listen to her sagacious advice. Why was I so naive? I would love to hate Stella and Dawn for talking about me like this behind my back, but the truth was everything that they had said, although it stung, was entirely true. How could I condemn the woman for that? Yet if Great-Aunt Betsy had been privy to this information, I would definitely not have wasted 10 years of my life being married to such a loser. For Great-Aunt Betsy would have told me straight what was going on, unlike Stella and Dawn, who had chosen to keep such invaluable knowledge far away from my ears. When I left the bathroom to return to the funeral service, I came out of that bathroom stall a different woman to the one that had entered it. For what I'd overheard being said had exponentially changed my life. My closed eyes were now wide open. I knew that my life was about to change in leaps and bounds, and some things would need to be violently purged out of my life, and one of them would be my husband Barlow. But I would break things off with him at my own pace. I would keep storm as to my knowledge about his betrayal, as I planned my exit from his life. I hoped to pull the carpet from under his feet, as his promiscuous lifestyle, spent fraternizing with other women behind my back, was finally going to catch up with him. So there we are. That is the end of part 2.
Part 3 is tomorrow night. I look forward to you joining me then. Until next time, goodbye and good night.